Good morning and welcome as we continue this series of To Be or to Not to Be the Church. This morning we move to the Paul's letter to the Romans, Romans 12. We looked at being a witness with the Great Commission, and then we moved from that last week to being a disciple. And this week with Paul's writing, we moved to putting faith in action, or putting theology in action with Paul's writing here. So we begin with the 12th chapter of Romans. A couple words about Paul's letter to Rome before I read the scripture. Paul had not been to the churches in Rome. He did not know them personally. This is different from the other writing that Paul has done, in that was all done to churches that Paul had an intimate relationship with, and most of it was written in response to a question or a situation that had become Paul had become aware of, and he was writing to address those situations and questions that had come up in the church. In this case, he did not know the people in the churches, he did not know the churches, but he was writing from what it seems to be a twofold purpose. He had this desire to go to Rome to minister to those churches. Actually, he had a bigger desire than that. His sight was really set on Spain, and Rome was just a stepping stone to get to Spain. At this point in time, Spain was emerging as a center of where the action was, so to speak, and Paul wanted to be a part of that action. The second purpose seems to be to introduce himself to the church so that they would know something about him. And in writing this, while there was not a specific question that was put to him, he's sort of throwing the umbrella out there and trying to cover as much as he can to help the churches grow there, as well as introduce himself. I have a friend who was getting ready to embark on a new study in his church, and he asked the church if they would like to have a Bible study on Romans, or if they would like him to do a study on theology and doctrine of the church. And I kind of laughed when he told me this, because there's really no difference. Much of our theology in the church today and doctrine of the church comes from Paul's writing to the church at Rome. It's Paul's theology, it's his doctrine, as he understands how God has been working things out. So it's a great source of information. It's one that I've always enjoyed as we turn to the scripture itself this morning. The 12th chapter. So, brothers and sisters, because of God's mercies, I encourage you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice that is holy and pleasing to God. This is your appropriate priestly service. Don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you can figure out what God's will is, what is good and pleasing and mature. The one other thing that I needed to mention there is that the writing to the church at Rome, Paul's letter to the Romans, is divided up into two parts. There are 16 chapters. The first 11 chapters are the theology. Chapters 12 through 16 is where you get to the how-to. How do you apply this to your life? And you know, the very first line there, so brothers and sisters, because of God's mercies, I encourage you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice that is holy and pleasing to God. That sort of marks that change of moving from the theology into this is how you're going to do it. This is how you need to live. present your bodies. The Greek language, as I've stated on several other occasions, uses, in some cases, many different words that we translate in the English language as one word. And this word body that we use in our language is one of those that the Greek language had at least two other words that were used for it. One use of the word in the Greek that the Greeks had a word for was your outward appearance. And your outward appearance that you had when, say, like you were 10 years old and now that you have at your present age are different and will continue to be different from as you go through life. The body changes. It's a natural part of, dare I say, evolution. That's just the way things are. But there's another word that the Greeks use that we translate as body, and that's the essence of who you are. And there is less change with that, if any change, as you age physically. And that's the word that was used in the Greek here when Paul says to present your bodies. In other words, present your being, who you are. Present that to God as a living sacrifice that is holy and pleasing to God. Now, while I said that was something that is less changeable, or a subject less to change, it does change. And some of that change is through the disciplining of our lives. And I think that's where the word sacrifice comes in here, that sometimes in order to discipline things, you have to give up some other things. And Paul's saying that if there are things that you know that you need to change in your life in order for that essence of your being to be pleasing to God, then you need to exert that discipline. And that can be a sacrifice. But there's another element at work here, and that is allowing yourself or opening yourself to God making that change in your life, so that you can, your life will be, not your body, but your life, as I've saying the use of the word body there, that your life will be pleasing to God, how you're living your life. And he goes on to say that is your appropriate private priestly service. Some other translations use worship in that place there. And the essence, it seems to be, that Paul is getting across here is that worship is not something that you do in church on Sunday morning. Worship is how you live your life. And if you're living it as something that is pleasing to God, then that's something of value to God. I was thinking as I was working on this, I heard a workshop that we had here in Bedford, and a man who's a member of David Whitehurst's church, or was at that time, was recounting how somebody had witnessed to him. And he said that this man, who was a big burly man, wore bib overalls, that something had happened in his life, and he started seeing this man was always there early at his machine. It was a machine shop where they worked. He was always there early. He was always had his Bible around and would spend his lunchtime reading and looking at scripture, and just stood out. And then the plant was closing, and on the last day that they were working together, that he approached this man and he says, I want to know what it is in your life. I see that something has changed, and I want to know what happened to your life. And he said when this guy turned around, he said tears were running down his face. That after God had literally reached down and transformed his life, he had been praying or thought he understood in his prayer time that God wanted him to witness to somebody else at where he worked. And this was the last day, and he thought that he had heard God's prayer wrong. As it turns out, my path crossed the path of this big burly man later on. His name was Bill Brewer. He lives out here in Bedford County, out next to Bethesda, literally almost right across the road from Bethesda United Methodist Church. But Bill was living his life in a way that was appropriate worship to God. It was a way that was pleasing to God in that transformation there. Another word that we probably needs to be looked at here is it says, so that you can figure out what God's will is, what is good and pleasing and mature. When we talk about God's will, we tend to do that in a personal way, whether it be individually or corporately as a body. We might want to know what God's will is for our life. We might try to express how we understand God's will for our life. Or as a church, we might be trying to understand and express God's will for the church body. But the way that it's used here, according to William Barclay, seems to be that to figure out what God's will is in a much bigger umbrella. What God's will is, as he's understanding the way Paul has written it here, is that all of creation, going all the way back to Genesis and the creation of the world, and how God formed all the parts of the world, that was God's will, and that how all of that fits together in harmony, how we insert our lives into that in a harmonious way. That's the way that Paul's expressing God's will here. Any thoughts? I've been doing a lot of talking. You all have been sitting here this morning.
I never really thought about God fitting yourself into God's will. Like you said, I think about what is God's will for me or Main Street Church, but not fitting me into his will.
It's a much bigger picture.
Makes some sense.
Yeah. I want to close here. I don't usually read Phillips' translation, but one of the commentaries that I was looking at included J.B. Phillips' translation of these two verses. And as I read it, I thought that it really, just like Eugene Peterson does with the Message, it really captures this in a way that I think you could, at least with my mind, that I can wrap my mind around Paul's writing here in a better way. And that's how I wanted to close out this session on Romans 1 and 2. Phillips translates, with eyes wide open to the mercies of God, I beg you, my brothers, as an act of intelligent worship, to give him your bodies as a living sacrifice, consecrated to him and acceptable by him. Don't let the world around you squeeze it into its own mold, but let God remold your minds from within, so that you might prove in practice that the plan of God for you is good, meets all his demands, and moves toward the goal of true maturity. Well, I hope that you'll be joining us in worship later on today as Pastor Dawn does like Paul has done here and helps us to see how this fits into the living of our lives here at Main Street. If you're online, I hope that you'll continue to be there online as our worship continues today. May God's blessing be upon all of you.